So, you've got the reading in front of you, and I want to open up with you tonight, particularly with a view to helping you prepare for tonight's communion opportunity around the Lord's table. And because of that, I want to talk on the particular subject, one subject that kind of arises out of this, and that's the subject of self-examination. Taking a good look at yourself. Making an honest assessment of the situation. What do you see? Who are you? Who are you? Do you know who you are? And do you need reminding sometimes who you are? So I'm saying this because it being communion in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, if I just remind you, one of the things that we find in the way that Paul conveyed to the church in Corinth what Jesus had taught him about how the Lord's table was supposed to be conducted. He then just passed on to the church in Corinth, didn't he? And in the 11th chapter, which gets read, almost predictably at a communion service, he writes one or two things. But I just want to look at verses 26 to 34 and just read those two, just a couple of verses before you, because they have a striking seriousness about them. Chapter 11, verse 26 says, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. There's something very serious there, isn't it? Until he comes, you're making a lifelong commitment until Jesus returns, essentially. And you're making a statement. You're not coming to be fed primarily, but you're coming to declare something about Christ and his death, to say something by eating and drinking, by accepting, by you taking it in, you are speaking out and declaring the Lord's death until he comes. And therefore, we love the therefores of the Bible, don't we? Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. That's pretty serious, isn't it? The importance of really evaluating what it is. If you're going to make this statement, if you're going to make this commitment, you've got to make sure that you know what you're doing. You've got to know what you're saying. A man then ought to examine himself. Verse 28, that's the key verse for tonight. Ought to examine. You've got to take a look at yourself before he eats the bread and drinks of the cup. For anybody who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. That's why many amongst you are weak and sick. A number of you have fallen asleep, we read. Serious stuff. But if we judged ourselves, we would not come under judgment. When we're judged by the Lord, we're being disciplined so that we will not be condemned with the world. So those sort of things have got to be in our minds, haven't they, as we come to the Lord's table. This is a serious matter that we've got to this business of self-examination. In other words, self-examination is not an option. It's not something you can do if I feel like it this week. It's something that we always have to be doing as a part of what we're about tonight. Now, okay, let's step back from that for a moment and just recognize that the book of Corinthians was written to a church that was so dysfunctional that the letter that he writes to that church is a blistering letter of judgments, as it were, against them and their practices. I mean, the church in Corinth is a church in name, but in practice, well, put it like this, probably the number one problem at Corinth is that there was no love in the church. Now, I don't care what a church is supposed to be, right? But if there's no love, is it a church? Is it a church? How will people know that you are my disciples unless you love each other, right? It is essential. The culture of the church is critical. It's not an optional thing. They can say all the right things from the front, but if we don't live it out, if it's not practiced, and so when Paul is writing to this church, he said, look at yourself. Do an exam. Put yourself to the test. He's written to them, he's saying, faith, hope, and love. And of all of these, the one thing that remains is love. That is the thing. That is, the love of God is what's brought the whole world into being. It's what sent Christ into the world. It's what sends the Spirit into your heart. It's love, love, love. That's what this is. And if there's no love, then friends, take a look in the mirror. Because you shouldn't be coming to this table. Not like that. Not like that. Now, so I'm stepping back and recognizing that, this injunction to examine themselves was in the context of a crisis in the church, okay? Thankfully, by the grace of God, most churches are not in that kind of a crisis, okay? But even if we're not in a crisis where we would say, here's a fellowship and there's no love in the fellowship, we're not in a crisis like that by the grace of God. I trust that's not the case. In fact, I have more than enough evidence to be able to stand before God and say that isn't so. Nevertheless, does that mean that we are not to examine ourselves? Is it not a good idea from time to time to stop and reflect and think about how we're living, how are we doing? Because there is also, at the other end of the spectrum, no perfect church. This is not a perfect church. Do you accept that? So, the biggest room in all of our houses should be the room for, come on, it's the oldest joke in the book. Improvement, the room for improvement. So the whole process of judging ourselves and examining ourselves is say, okay, we accept that's what being a Christian is. The precondition of being a Christian is I'm not perfect. If you're perfect, you don't need to be a Christian. You need to be in heaven, surrounded by angels, praising your holy name, okay? But for the rest of us, we need to be in church. And the rest of us need to grow in grace, and we need to change, and we need to, be making progress. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the outflow of examining ourselves was that we make one good step towards being a bit more like Jesus? A little bit wiser, a little bit kinder, a little bit bolder, a little bit more servant-hearted. You can think of all the different attributes of our glorious Lord Jesus. And you can look at him like a beautiful diamond with all those different aspects of him. You can look at it from so many different perspectives and look at Jesus and say, do you not want a bit more of that? And maybe there's something tonight about Jesus you say, would that I could grow in this. And sometimes it is a very good exercise not to try and say, oh, wretched sinner that I am, I'm terrible and dreadful, and I'm a sinner, and Jesus is perfect, and all that. But actually just look at one thing. Just take one thing. And if I could grow in grace in this one thing, well, that would be good for me. It would be good for my neighbors. It would be good for my workmates. It would be good for the world. It would be good for the church. Teach me, Lord. Help me to grow. So self-examination, it's kind of interesting. If you look up the word to examine, the verb to examine in the Bible, I wonder which book you think would have the most frequent use of the verb. That wasn't necessarily a rhetorical question, but it might end up being one. Let's see. I wonder which book of the Bible would you say examining is a kind of a frequently used term, more than any other book in the Bible? James, interesting theory. But no. But thank you for being bold. Isn't she great, right? Joshua. No, Frank. Leviticus.
Well, it's pretty close.
For you, Frank, it was close. The book of Leviticus is the book full of directions for priests. We were thinking about it a bit on Good Friday. And priests have to keep making examinations, examining the sacrifices. Are they right? Are they perfect? Are they acceptable? Going into people's houses, looking at the mold on their walls. Is this house habitable, or does it need to be condemned? Looking at the pots and pans that people are using, are they clean? Is there hygiene in the camp of Israel? Examining, and looking at the moral standing of the people. Is what that person has done a sin? If that is a sin, then they need to offer this sacrifice to atone for that sin. They're always examining. And when we've been looking in the book of Hebrews, we've been talking about the fact that Christians are a royal priesthood. And therefore, what you're being called to do in self-examine is a priestly ministry. And as you examine yourself, because, the whole point about the priest was it's one thing to go examining everybody else, but with the same brush that you get tarred with, you've got to make sure that you're right too. And if you examine yourselves, am I fit to this table? Are things right? Is this suitable? Is this the time? Should I come to this? Am I in faith? How am I living? What's the center? And this is the question we're going to come around to. What is the center? Is it me? Am I living basically about me? Or is Christ at the center of my life? And if he's not, am I prepared to make the change? Am I prepared to repent and turn a little and put him in his rightful place and put myself out? Because that's not where I deserve to be, and it's certainly not where it would be good for me to be, because you can't handle it. You can't handle it, but Christ can. And that's why it's a good thing, isn't it, to make these kinds of changes. Now, I suppose you're thinking, what's this got to do with Exodus chapter 18? Should we go to Exodus chapter 18 just for a treat to actually get to the text I'm supposed to be speaking on? Should be useful. Exodus chapter 18. And here we have Moses. And Moses is this guy, he's a Levite himself, and we see him sitting and dishing out advice to people. He's examining people. He's listening to their stories. He's listening to their life experience. He's listening to their struggles. He's answering their questions. He's considering it all and say, what's the will of God in this? And he's doing it all day long, every day. But the big question I think this passage asks is the great advisor capable of taking some great advice? And I suppose that is all about how you see yourself. If you basically think you're it, and you've got all the answers, then you're not going to listen to anybody. But if you're a humble person, and I think one of the really staggering things about Moses and the way that he is portrayed in his own writings is the way he gives us these opportunities to see his weaknesses, his flaws, his shortcomings. He confesses his own sins. He doesn't present himself as being something perfect. And it's very like the Apostle Paul, who in his own words, the great Apostle Paul said, I am the chief of sinners. Humble people. You see, when you've walked with God, when you've known God, he strips you bare. You're under no illusions about yourself anymore. And somebody else may come and big you up and flatter you, but you know the truth. I know what I am, and God knows what I am. And there's no point in pretending. And Moses doesn't see any point in pretending. He just tells the story. This great advisor and this humility which basically exhibits. And it's interesting that it says, doesn't it, in the book of Exodus that he was the most humble man on earth, and yet he wrote the book. Is that kind of like, hang on a minute, you're describing yourself? But I think what he's saying is something like Paul is saying, I'm the chief of sinners. He's like saying, I'm under no illusions about myself. And the evidence of that is seen all the way through these accounts, that when a man comes to him, though he's dishing out all this advice to all these people, when somebody comes to him with a word of true wisdom, he's all ears. And that's a really good mark of humility, isn't it? Are you still listening? Are you still learning? Are you still growing? Or have you arrived? Because if you think you've arrived, you're deceived. Because you've got a long way to go. But you're going to get there with God's help. With God's help. So we see that in verses 15 to 20 that when he's so excited, isn't he? He's showing Jethro everything he's doing, and he's walking around the camp, and I'm sitting there all day, and all the people are coming to me, and it's really just like, I'm just dishing out the advice and stuff like that. And Moses says to him, what you're doing, literally says, what you are doing is not good. How do you take it? How would you take it? Here's something like, I am the very mouthpiece of God. I have literally I put my rod into the Red Sea and the sea opened. Plagues came down. I went toe to toe with Pharaoh. And you come to me and tell me that what I am doing is not good. What's that called when you get into that frame of mind where you are so completely full of yourself that you can't listen to anybody or anything? It's called pride. It can happen to anybody, right? It can happen to anybody. When self becomes so dominant that God is just your wingman. God is my navigator. He's not my Lord. It's not God Almighty. It's God my old matey. Right? And can you see what a dangerous position Moses is actually in, spiritually speaking? When everybody's coming to you, when you're ministering, when you're serving the Lord, when you're involved in church life, when you're being used of God, when you're powerful in prayer, when you're a great evangelist, whatever it is, you're the servant, the person who doesn't take any credit, you're quietly working, how pride could be there on the peripheries. And so when somebody says to you, what you're doing is not good, this is a critical test moment, isn't it, for self-examination. Hang on, am I still open? Am I still soft? Am I still ready to at least entertain something that somebody else might have to say to me? And 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, we don't have to turn back there. Let us examine ourselves before the table. It's probing us with the same question. Are you ready to listen? Are you willing to listen? Or have you got it all sorted out? Or is there something you might learn or something you might change? Or are you the done deal? Because if you're the done deal, this isn't for you. But if you're a work in progress, you might need something to eat. Just to strengthen you and help you as you put yourself into the process of repenting and turning and learning and changing and becoming maybe just that bit more like Christ, because you need it and we need it, that this should happen. It's a family reunion, isn't it? Chapter 18. Jethro's turned up. He's brought Moses' wife with him and his children with him. They've been separated for some considerable time, and in a way it's a bit like in movies when you get a cutaway shot. You've been very involved in the narrative. It's very, very involving, the book of Exodus. You get a couple of chapters at the beginning where you're introduced to who Moses is and his background, and then he goes down to Egypt, and then from then on it's just like, it's just one fantastic, exciting, action-packed thriller of a chapter after another, miracles and confrontations, and the whole Egyptian army just got wiped out. I mean, nothing much. It's really, really excited, and then suddenly your father-in-law shows up. Family life. And actually, you haven't been spending any time with your wife for quite some considerable time. And your children, who clearly adore and love you and have taken names that somewhat reflect the fact they've been spending more time with their grandparents than they have with you. And you've been busy with the Lord, and you have. But your wife and your children, have you been there for them? What is the first charge of every pastor? What's their first flock? Their first responsibility? It's your own households, your own families, all of us, first and foremost. And the truth is that he's sent his wife away. Too busy. And there he is in the midst of this situation where he's got all the people coming to him all day, every day. So he has this perpetual answer to every single demand upon his energies, and it is too busy. I'm too busy. I think it's one of the most common, when you ask people, how are you doing nowadays? Is it not true? Well, number one thing you say, how are you doing? I'm fine. That's the first one. Not true. I'm really busy. Busy and fine. And it's true. We may be doing lots of really, really good things. We may indeed be doing lots of really, really good things. But it's quite good that suddenly Jethro turns up into our lives and puts a mirror up and just says, is this good? Is it really good? Or are there changes that you need to make? Is there a balance that you need to change? Now, you know, the fact is, he doesn't confront him about the fact that his family, he's been separated from his family and he hasn't been with his family. He understands the situation, right? But what he is confronting is how completely self-absorbed Moses has become. He's only preoccupied by what's right in front of him all the time. He is busy and he's consumed and he's absorbed. And he actually needs to stand back. And that's what self-examination is all about, standing back from your life for a minute and looking at it with a bit of objectivity and asking yourself some questions. The fact is, the reason that Jethro's come down is because he's looked at Moses' life from the outside and he's seen that he is a busy man and God is using him and God is being glorified. Amazing things have been happening. He's not coming down to criticize him. Self-examination is not just opening yourself up to a critical spirit who's just going to rip you to shreds. He's excited. I hope you're excited about what the Lord is doing in your life. You should be excited about what the Lord is doing in your life. You're going to heaven, friends. You're on the road to heaven. That is really, really exciting. There's a lot of people who are not on your journey. You're a very blessed group of people. And certainly the observation that Jethro makes is that this is, you know, there's something really exciting going on in your life. So it's not coming to rip anything down. But verse 2, there are things that you still need to address. That doesn't mean that you've arrived, because you haven't. You need to make some changes. So, look, I'm basically saying that self-examination, which we're about tonight, is something for every season. It's not something you only do when there's been some crisis and everything's gone wrong. There's some really wonderful things going on in Moses' life. But it's still a good moment to stop and examine yourself and say, maybe there's something that I do need to change. Okay, let me just go through a little bit more with you. Is that all right? Still there? Still awake? Good. See, when Jethro sits down with Moses in the tent, verses 8 through to 10, and he listens, the observations that he's making from the outside that God is working, he hears from Moses, the excitement from Moses. And it's true. It's not that there's nothing going on. It's not that the whole thing's a sham. It's real. But as we get down to verse 14, it becomes clear, doesn't it, in verse 14, that even though God is at work, there are still things. I mean, to be point it blunt, the things you're doing is not right, is what he says, is he looks at it. Actually, the whole situation in the camp is completely disorganized. It's pretty chaotic. It's unsustainable. This is no way to do church. Everything resting on one person's shoulders. It's laughable. It's ridiculous. There are thousands of people, with heads and eyes and ears and brains and hearts and all that sort of thing, who could be involved in the work. But he's got himself so bottlenecked up into this situation that he's doing everything himself. It's DIY, do-it-yourself ministry, isn't it? One-man ministry at its worst. And it's very easy when you get very absorbed in something that your focus begins to narrow down. You get tired, you get fatigued, you get narrowed down, you get focused in, you lose perspective, and you stop seeing everybody else. You stop seeing everything else. You stop seeing the Lord even. It's just me and what I've got to do today and just going through that one thing after another and one thing after another. You don't realize what you've become. We need to break out. We need to be better, don't we? For the glory of God. And, Jethro is the man, isn't he, to come along. He needs a priest, and that's what Jethro is. He's a priest, isn't he? He needs someone. And this guy's been a priest a lot longer than Moses, who's only just joined the priest club. He's only been doing it for a few weeks, and yes, it's been dramatic and wonderful, but he needs somebody who's seasoned, who's been doing this for a long time. And yes, they've spent 40 years together as shepherding in the wilderness, but Jethro's been a shepherd. He knows the desert. He knows sheep. He knows it better than Moses does. And whatever Moses thinks he knows, he also knows in the context of this family relationship, somebody he loves, somebody he knows, somebody he trusts, somebody better than him, somebody who is a master while he is still a disciple, somebody who's still got a lot to learn. Jethro is the perfect person to speak to him. Have you got somebody like that in your life? Who is your better, your master? Who knows the terrain better than you do? Who's gone ahead of you and understands things? Let's be honest, you just don't get it yet. You're still wet behind the ears. You know what I'm going to say. Let me commend to you Jesus of Nazareth. Let me encourage you afresh and anew to go back to him and listen to what he has to say to you, to consider him and see the distance between where you are and where he is and see what you might learn from him. He's worthy, isn't he? Jethro is worthy, and we have got somebody far more worthy than Jethro coming along, willing, as we examine ourselves, to speak into our lives. And basically all Jethro shows him is the lack of common sense in what he's doing. It doesn't make any sense what you're doing. It's not practical to see what you're doing. But behind that lack of common sense, some people carry on doing stupid things. They carry on doing stupid things and they don't work, but they do them again and again and again and again. And they keep breaking and they keep failing. They do it again and again because actually behind it, they're addicted to that kind of position or power, and it's about self. And actually, it's harder for Moses to actually look around to all these people and trust some people around him and think maybe they've got values and they've got contributions to make, and maybe God is working in their lives. And I actually need to spend some time with my wife and work through our relationship. And I need to teach my children. And parents here, raising your kids, it's a big thing. It's a big thing to raise your children. It's a big thing to be in intimate personal relationships with people. A lot of people find it easier to be at work, to be busy at work, than up against the cold face of personal relationships and working through personal relationships. Yeah. This very, very practical bit of advice that Jethro gives him, but behind it there's a world. And in verse 19, Jethro asks him this question, is what I'm saying to you, you've got to evaluate this. If the hat doesn't fit, don't wear it. But you've got to evaluate, is this God speaking to you? And I just think it's beautiful the way that in verse 24, Moses has clearly thought through the issues. Said, yes. Yeah, I accept it. I accept it. I'm going to make the change. I'm going to make the change. Will you do that? So I'm going to make a change. I love the way Jethro speaks to him. In verses 19 to 20, he's so honoring to Moses. He's not tearing a strip off him. He's not belittling him. Self-examination is about you and me being built up. It's about us growing. It's a good thing. One last thing before I wind up. I can talk for hours. At the very kind of conclusion of this passage, we can sort of see that change comes within this congregation. This big congregation. It's been very much one-man ministry, but by the end of the passage, a very significant transformation has happened in the life of this church. I take the word church by the meaning of congregation, a gathering, a big gathering, an organization of God's people. And now, it's not one person, and now all these multiple dependents standing in these long queues waiting for their time with the minister. Imagine sitting there all day long waiting for your appointment with the minister. Now, hundreds and thousands of people are involved with ministering to one another. People with gifts and abilities have just risen up and say, you don't have to go to him. I can help you. I know the Lord. I went through the Red Sea. I've been through the waters. I've seen the miracles. I believe in God. And I can minister to you. I can serve you. Chapter 18 is seriously radical church transformation, isn't it? Can you see it? It looks quite pedestrian when you read it, but this is miraculous transformation and change. Just because one person said, I'm not going to be the center. Let God be the center, and may God's people arise. You want to arise? You're going to take your place? This was a church at the beginning who had a glorious and charismatic leader and an eldership who basically were the yes men. And no deacons, no servants kind of broadly shouldering and sharing the burden of the work. But at the end, there's elders and deacons and, so good. And just the absolute proof that this wisdom, this counsel that came from Jethro to Moses was indeed God. It's not just the fact that they did it, that Moses accepted it, because Moses did get things wrong, didn't he? And the deacons, this group of people who came into the ministry at this point, there's a record in Deuteronomy as Moses looks back on this period and the way that these new people came into ministry and took their place and took responsibility and stopped sitting on the edge of things and standing in line and being in the queue, but at being active participants in the life of the church. Just reflect on that period, and that group of people who came into those positions of responsibility did make one huge catastrophic error. They were the people who counseled that Israel should not enter into the promised land because the sons of Anak were too big and too tall and we couldn't fight them. They made mistakes. People make mistakes. And mistakes, friends, are not little trite things that you throw away. Sometimes they're costly, sometimes they're painful. But the wisdom of God says it's better that you have one sort of nearly perfect person being collapsed under the weight of ministry than it is for lots of people to be involved And yes, it gets messy sometimes. But when you get to the book of Acts and the apostles are facing the kind of downforce and pressure of the work, in Acts chapter 6, they take exactly the same advice that Jethro gave Moses, and straight away they hand over the responsibility to a bunch of deacons. They're willing to share the shoulder of the work. And yes, friends, what they're looking for people to trust, are people who are wise, full of the Holy Spirit, trustworthy people, and there isn't a single Christian on earth who shouldn't be trustworthy, faithful, wise unto salvation, and so on. So in other words, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? So pray about it. I'm sure you can think of a number of reasons why it's not you. Doubt them, friends. Because, finally, self-examination is good for the church. It's good for the church, for the growth of the church, for the glory of God. Christ has purchased a body. We invite people to come along to church, to get into community and relationship with believers, to be part of this kingdom, to live under Christ's rule, not to come and sit on a chair listening to whosoever, him up the front. That's not the plan. Well, we're going to be taking communion in a moment. We're going to 624. Should we sing 624? Let's not sing the word 624, and let's not sing it like we were singing the number 624. 624.